Peter, the question of God's existence is not only a perennial one, but seems today in an age of science to be even more in the public consciousness. How do you, as an analytical philosopher, look at this question, irrespective of your own belief? How can we begin to think rigorously about this question?
The first thing to realize, I think, is that what we say about the question is going to depend on what we mean by the word God. If you, of course, mean by the word God an old man who lives in the sky and tosses thunderbolts at evildoers and so on, this is going to give the question a very different aspect from what you would have if you had a, let's say, more orthodox conception of God. If you think of God as an old man in the sky, then you're thinking of him as one physical object among others. You can ask what the source of the energy in the lightning bolts is, and why don't objects fall? Why aren't they gravitationally attracted towards him, and so on. It becomes a purely scientific question, and the idea, and I suppose the answer to the scientific question is no, there isn't any such being as that. Obviously so. Obviously not. And if you indeed needed science to answer that question for you at all. But if you think of God as theists generally have done, you'll see that he's not a part of the system of objects that make up the world. He is, as they say, omnipresent. But that doesn't mean he's spread out in space like the luminiferous ether of 19th century physics, which was everywhere. No, he doesn't have, because part of the luminiferous ether would be in one place and another part would be in the other. He doesn't have parts spread out in space. He isn't spread out in space like a physical object. Rather, he's omnipresent more or less the way, say, Rembrandt is present at every point in the Night Watch. That is, he's the author of the whole thing, and his being and his mind are reflected at every point in the thing. You can't raise, I think, any scientific questions that are relevant to the existence of such a being. That doesn't mean that science is irrelevant to various religious claims, because it obviously is possible for claims to be made by religions that are inconsistent with things science has shown to be true. What I'm saying is this: just the proposition alone that such a being as this exists, independent of what he may have done or what he may have put into the world, that doesn't seem to be something that can be settled by science at all.
Some scientists disagree with that.
Yes, I know, but I don't see what they're... I think that they must be thinking of God as something who's part of the world like the rest of us.
Or they could say that the things that this God would do would be reflected in things in the world, and we don't see those things.
Well, we see the world itself. We see the laws of physics. Do you mean by reflected read off? That you could read the existence of God off these things?
Or that even God would be a good explanation of these things, or something that's helpful in understanding. They would just say, if we have the laws of physics, maybe there are.
This doesn't sound to me at all like an argument for the non-existence of God. This sounds like the following point: if we look around at the world around us, there's no reason. It gives us no reason to suppose that there is such a being as God, and therefore, by some sort of Occam's razor principle or something, we should assume that God doesn't exist.
It's an added complexity that doesn't help the problem. It just kicks it up one level and adds one level of complexity.
But that's an argument, of course, for the conclusion that we shouldn't assume that God exists. It's not an argument for the conclusion that we should assume that God doesn't exist. It's really an argument, I think, for agnosticism. Because if you think about it, they're not saying you're better off believing that God doesn't exist. They're saying you're better off not believing that God does exist. He'd be an added complexity, and so on. All right, so don't believe in him. There's an argument for agnosticism. It's not an argument for atheism. Many attempts have been made to turn that argument into an argument for atheism, but it simply can't be done.
Yeah.
That is an argument from, you need something more positive to get to that. So maybe the interesting thing, though, is to consider this as an argument for agnosticism.
Great.
So why should I believe that there is a God when I look at the world, and it doesn't force me to believe that there is such a thing as God, or it isn't obviously the best explanation? I would just have to ask this person what the general epistemological rule is here, that you shouldn't believe in something unless your experience forces this hypothesis on you as the only possible truth. I don't think that these people themselves actually follow that rule very consistently in life. But for example, that they have political or aesthetic or even philosophical beliefs that aren't forced upon them by their experience this way. And I don't see why, if it's all right, say, to believe that you should vote for the candidate from this political party, even though this isn't forced on you by your experience, then why isn't it all right to believe in God when it isn't forced on you by your experience?
But isn't God's existence something fundamentally different than almost anything else we can think about, politics, art, other kinds of things? We're dealing with trying to get to some fundamental reality, not just an opinion of what's good or best.
Some belief that you have either goes beyond the evidence, in any given sense it goes beyond the evidence, or it doesn't. I don't see it makes any difference what it's about or what its content is. Either there's a rule that says you shouldn't believe things that go beyond the evidence you have available, or there's a rule that allows you to believe in things that go beyond the evidence.
If I want a political opinion, I know I'm just sort of making up an opinion. I have different reasons or backgrounds. I might change it, and I don't really put a lot of stock in it.
Do you have a? Well, you say the question is, do you have a belief?
I have a political belief.
So that's how you think things are.
Right.
You don't think that's probably how things are, or that if so, that would be your political belief. Probably things.
Yeah. Okay.
Are this way, but people don't always put their beliefs in that form. You can find scientists arguing about whether gamma ray bursts occur inside the galaxy or at cosmic distances. You can find physical anthropologists arguing about whether Neanderthal genes survive in modern human beings or not. It's quite clear from these impassioned discussions that each side actually believes the thing that it's arguing in favor of, or at least believes it's true to such a high probability it's not worth worrying about the consequence. And yet, here's this other side in the same debate that has access to all the same evidence that takes the other position. It's clear that at least one of the two sides, maybe both, I would say probably both, but that doesn't follow logically. At least one of the two sides has gone beyond what the evidence will justify. Is there anything wrong with that? Well, at any rate, if there's nothing, I don't see the difference between going beyond the evidence and believing that Neanderthal genes are present in the modern human genome and going beyond the evidence and believing that God exists.
So what follows from that? What can we then infer to the way to think about whether God exists?
Well, I don't presume to tell anybody how to think about anything, except I have a couple of negative admonitions. One of them would be, don't have this double standard. That is, don't tell people that it's wrong to have religious beliefs that go beyond the evidence, but okay to have scientific beliefs or political beliefs or philosophical beliefs that go beyond the evidence. Obviously, almost all beliefs that my fellow philosophers have must be beliefs that go beyond the evidence, because they all disagree with each other and they all have access to more or less the same, whatever evidence may be. In philosophy, I guess, arguments, pieces of philosophical text, they almost go beyond it. I don't see why that isn't allowed to people in religion as well. Of course, you could say, well, it shouldn't be allowed to anybody. But maybe that's right. That's what the great epistemological preacher of the 19th century W.K. Clifford said. But nobody does follow that rule. And I'm just saying I don't want that license or liberty to be denied to people in the case of religious beliefs alone.